Okay, so let's talk through chapter 3. Focus on this particular chapter is going to be on electronic business value, or the value of leveraging technology in business. There's a couple concepts that are floating around as we're looking at this stuff. This idea of, I guess, evolutionary technology, which is really kind of the next generation or the next iteration of a product. Like, for example, Microsoft, Apple, for the past 11 years has come out with a new version of the iPhone on pretty much a regular basis. All right, so that's, you see, you had kind of a, so from 2000, probably from like 2008 or 9 on, what you have is, kind of an iterative next generation, additional features and functions of the iPhone. All right. However, in 2007, when it was introduced, the iPhone was actually a very disruptive uh, technology. It was basically something that really shook up the market. It was not the first smartphone. There's actually been a number of other uh, organizations that had done work with handheld devices and things like that. Take, for example, BlackBerry and Microsoft, and you know invested a lot of time and a lot of effort around this stuff. All right, so there was kind of a market that was out there, had not really solidified, had not really been consolidated until really the iPhone uh, in 2007, the first generation iPhone, was really seen as a disruptive technology. It was in terms of its functionality, its ability to seamlessly integrate, to have a simplified user interface, not even using keyboards, but everything going to a touch. Its ability to provide integration. It was that really was really a. And you see these on occasion. You'll see these like disruptive technologies. All right. So what you'll see is they don't happen every day, and not every technology that gets introduced is disruptive. It would like to be, but not everything will be. So as we talk around this idea of digital Darwinism, that there are organizations out there. I guess if we look at the case of the iPhone, we see organizations like BlackBerry, which was tremendously successful, in the early 2000s with basically a handheld email, all right, which the iPhone really kind of supplanted. So the idea is, and actually they had spent a lot of effort after the iPhone came out to try to compete, and ultimately was overtaken and really has faded from the market. So the idea is, if you can't adapt to new demands in the information age, really things go away. So if you look at a company like Polaroid back in the day, Polaroid had significant, market position, had a unique product. Nobody was ever doing anything quite like that. Um, but yet, in the end, it basically is not, is not factor anymore. Right? So we see that, in other examples, Blockbuster. The question is, you can actually look at any organization or any kind of technology. Um, is okay. What is there a disruptive technology that could basically uh, ultimately destroy a company, destroy an organization? There's been some organizations, especially in technology, you got a whole series of computer companies that were out there that really just don't exist anymore. So a good example would be Digital Equipment Corporation, which is a tremendous innovator all through the 60s, 70s, and 80s with technology. But as it entered into the 90s, basically ceased to exist. Right. So we look at we saw Blockbuster as totally just being disintermediaried out of existence by uh, Netflix. So we look at Tesla. So you look at all the players out there. Think about whether or not something like a Google or an Amazon or something of that scale, Facebook. could they be replaced? Could they be, taken out of, moved out of the market by some other disruptive technology? The answer is possibly, but it's going to be something of a disruptive technology scale that's going to take it to move. We talk, as we had just talked about, disruptive versus sustaining. So disruptive is really a new way of doing things. Sometimes it doesn't meet existing consumer needs. It actually does a new. Sometimes it approaches new ways of doing things. So you see a couple different things like that. Netflix, for example, was in particular, kind of came out as an alternative to Blockbuster, but then invented a whole new way of going to market with streaming. So that was kind of a whole new way. And this idea is, the characteristics of a disruptive technology is it opens new markets and it destroys old ones. And then compared to that, is sustaining technology, kind of the next iteration, the next version of something, build around the concept of better, faster, cheaper. So, you would argue, over the past 10, 11 years, every September, Apple has come out with a new generation of the iPhone, which is adds features, adds functionality, that are compelling enough to make people upgrade or go to the next version, next generation. The challenge with a lot of organizations is what we call the innovator's dilemma. How can you take advantage of a disruptive technology without messing up your your existing technologies or your existing markets as they're out there? Great case about this, as we look back at Kodak. Kodak is actually the created the digital camera. One of the main reasons why Kodak does not exist is because of the digital camera. They made a conscious decision to maintain and sustain and protect their existing film-based product lines, which was a good decision at one particular point in time, but ultimately became their undoing as things went along. So really the balance becomes really, trying to balance both, your current state, trying to, being able to, drive existing improvements in existing products, maintaining and protecting and sustaining existing markets, while in addition, being on the lookout for disruptive technologies, because disruptive, being able to, the challenge is to be able to harness the power of a disruptive technology versus having a disruptive technology destroy you. So the World Wide Web, arguably the World Wide Web can be seen as one of the significant business disruptor slash society disruptor that we've seen over the past 40 years. All right, so the World Wide Web is actually a relatively new innovation. So it was actually the internet. People use the terms interchangeably between the internet and the World Wide Web. They are not the same things. The internet has actually been around a bit longer. Right? So the internet, the origins of the internet go back to the 1960s, and research and academic institutions and military, basically developing a shared distributed communication network. It had been around through origins of it were in the 60s, where it was basically put into play in the 70s into the 80s. Did not really emerge as a real force until like the early 90s. The World Wide Web itself was actually developed. Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who is the creator of the generally identified as being the creator of the World Wide Web, created it in 1989. The internet and the World Wide Web really did not was not accessible by people, by your general consumer, until like 91, 92. Right? So this idea of, this, so this stuff is relatively new, but it's had an impact, a significant impact over a very short period of time. So the mechanisms you see is, this idea of the web uh, uses something called HTML, a language, which is hypertext markup language, right, which is really what um, Berners-Lee had developed basically as a collaboration tool, be able to uh, send messages to it, send requests from a client or a client machine, which is in this case a web browser, um, to go to a server and retrieve information back. In its simplest form, that's really what the internet does. A lot of other stuff has been added into it, new capabilities, new functionalities. But in effect, what it is you have a client, you have a server, you send a request, it responds to the request. All right. So we've seen different types of web browsers. The most noteworthy ones now are probably Chrome, Google Chrome, Internet Explorer, which is Microsoft's products, and then there's an open source product called Firefox. So those are the three main ones. The original one was a product called Netscape, which was actually an adaptation of something that was been developed in an academic from the academic side called Mosaic. A company called Netscape developed a commercial browser. It was ultimately subsumed. I think it's become Firefox now. I think our Firefox traces its roots back to that. Uh, the other mechanism that is kind of within this internet structure is what we call concept of a URL, or Universal Resource Locator, which is an addressing scheme. All right. So what you have is, you'll see the www.apple.com, which is a URL. Uh, what happens within the internet when you do browsing, what it will do is it will take that name, which is kind of a user accessible name, something people can deal with, translate it into a numerical representation, which represents an address of a resource or a server or something on the internet, and it can find it. So the internet is actually pretty simple. And, one of the things, especially in order to scale the way we see the internet is scaled, you want to have something that's simple. Something that's simple and easy, then you can continue to repeat it, and really achieve massive growth. So it's a fairly simple mechanism, uh, but it is efficient, and more importantly, it works. So the Web 1.0. So first origins of the web, go back to uh, from coming out of the scientific and academic world, was really just kind of the ability to kind of log onto the internet and gain access to data. So you would do is you go out, you could you go to a location, you had an address, you would go and bring something back. What that in fairly short order evolved into kind of a more commercial approach of actually being able to not just simply retrieve information, but being able to gather, be able to do queries, be able to execute interactions. All right. So the idea of being able to buy and sell over the internet, which is a fairly, probably within like 3 or 4 years, you saw, a huge growth in that. So Amazon was really obviously an early innovator in that space, but there were other ones out there, some of which have survived, some of which have not. Uh, so the idea of we call e-commerce is this idea of buying and selling goods over the internet. A broader scope, let's look at this in a broader scope, this idea of e-business. So the idea it's e-commerce plus all other types of activities. So the idea is from a company perspective, part of what you do is e-commerce. But if we think around processes, business processes, and kind of using technology around that, overall it makes up this. We think of this as what we call e-business. So e-commerce is a subset of e-business, and e-business is really kind of the extension, the utilization of technology across, with to drive business and business activities. So some of the stuff, as we were kind of looking at this, what they call the term that gets used is Web 1.0. So, so from a rough time frame, Web 1.0 kind of went from 1991 when the internet hit the street to about 2003, to some approximate time frame. A bunch of stuff happened in that time frame. So you saw a whole, kind of a very rapid evolution of technology, a huge expansion of utilization. Um, you saw things like the innovations, like, for example, the idea of a search engine, which, Google is the one we think of right now. Google has really established a very dominant place in the marketplace, but it was not the first. Actually, the first web search engine was a product called Alta Vista. And there were other ones out there as well. You've seen Yahoo is in that, has been historically been in that game. All right. But what we saw was, so there was a whole bunch of stuff happening. But this kind of in a time period from '91 to 2003 is, what we call, Web 1.0. This also covers the time frame from, say, the mid '90s to about 2001, 2002 was the dot-com era, which was the first, huge, like a gold rush of technical innovation, which, like a lot of gold rushes, ended probably not quite that well, in the 2000, 2001 time frame where the, dot-com crashed. Right. So the idea, we kind of look at this, kind of from through this first time frame. We got to the internet. The thing was interesting. After the dot-com crash, even though there was, the dot-com crash was not because the internet was a bad technology. It didn't go away. It was really kind of, well, the first generation of stuff, reach exceeded the grasp. But it was really kind of a repositioning from a business perspective. From my experience, having worked in the chemical vertical at that time, there was a big focus on, well, we're going to create all these chemical exchanges and set a lot of stuff up. A lot of that stuff kind of, that was kind of an early on focus area, but they kind of went away. All right. So then it was, kind of the post 2001. There was kind of a rethinking and kind of refocusing of, well, how do we use this stuff? All right. So, couple different thoughts here. So Michael Porter, our guy Porter, one of the things he talked about was this idea of, vertical integration, standalone vertical integrated organizations. Kind of his vision, that basically you string everything together and you do this through an electronic means. So you go end to end. You actually reduce suppliers. You basically do everything internally, and you do this through through the use of technology. Right? That's one particular point of view. Another point of view, and this would be more Don Tapscott. The internet favors partnering, networking suppliers to the core firm. So the idea is you would have, the idea of leveraging technology to integrate yourself with other players, both on the front end, basically integrating yourself or aligning yourself with customers, on the front end, and then also on the back end. Right? This idea of different types of integration, but leveraging the capabilities of the internet and internet capabilities, internet functionality to be able to do this stuff. So some of the examples we see, like with GE at the time, a lot of work around establishing partnering arrangements with organizations. Boeing was particularly being able to leverage, because you think about with Boeing, the aircraft construction coordination of activities across a whole bunch of suppliers, being able to identify, streamline that. We talk around some of the other areas, contract manufacturing, auto, basically using the internet as a means of extending out without necessarily, you can do a vertically integrated, you take the, as Porter would say, a vertically integrated model, or you can create basically in effect, a virtually integrated organization through partnerships, but tightly integrated back into organizations. All right, so there's two different kind of thinkings as we look around this. So as we said, one, kind of Web 1.0, what was e-business in 91 to 2003. So, at this point you've seen, the experience we've had over the past, say, 20, 30 years now, coming up on 30 years, the impact it's had on retail, on travel, on entertainment, you know, auto, the whole, each industry, there's been some industries more than others, but the impact is, we see it across the board, has changed the way companies deal with customers, has changed the way customers deal with suppliers, and kind of created a whole new market, which is really what we see with this Web 1.0. One of the other big factors we saw was this idea of expanding global reach. The whole idea of the internet was, that it extended. It's really connecting up the planet. Every place on the planet you have accessibility to. So the idea is you can extend your market in your operations in all sorts of different ways. So you can actually, from a sales perspective, you can expand your markets, universally, across into whole new ways. On the good side, the bad side would be you could actually have competitors coming in, leveraging the same technology that could potentially be serve as a force against you. All right. It really is, the ease of use, it's the content, the growth of content, the ability to be able to leverage a lot of this stuff. We've seen, that I think in a lot of ways that's been one of the big impacts. The fact that it has erased a lot of barriers. It has changed the means by which organizations and people all can interact. So that's really kind of what we see in kind of the modern world. So some of the interesting things we've seen around being able to do more, new type of markets and things of that nature. Concept of mass customization. So the idea is that if ideally what you want to do is understand what a customer wants, and then meet their specific needs. Now, historically, this was done in kind of a very coarse fashion. You would kind of do you would kind of identify what would be a target market, and then kind of aim for something that would have an approach or some sort of something that would appeal to that whole to a kind of a fairly broad spectrum. The idea, though, is you can actually do mass customization. The idea of mass customizations is that you can adjust, you can fine tune, your product offerings for very specific markets. So the idea of, say, custom M&Ms would be an example, or something that would have a very specific, much more specific focus area. Right? So that's kind of one concept. The other end is what we call, concept we call is personalization. So one of the things that's happening is, as a byproduct of these interactions, of customers being kind of logging onto a site, and then their activities can be evaluated, captured, basically being able to see kind of what they do, gain some insights into kind of how they think. That information can be gathered, analyzed, and then really used as a means by which to establish what we call personalization. So Amazon's probably one of the best examples of this. Basically, it gathers enough information about what you look at, where do you go, how frequently do you go, how much do you buy, and then it can determine, what would be the most likely thing you would want to, what you would want to do, and it does things to put things out in front of you, and kind of, you know, they use a number of different mechanisms around that. So a lot of times you go on there and you'll see, you know, you know, based upon what your previous buying habits were. Here's like 20 more things you might want to buy, with the idea of being able to, if you hit that, if you can hit that, you can get people to buy, or you target additional sales around that. So this whole personalization is it's a very interesting area, because what you're finding is that, the more information you get, the more data you can collect, the more you can personalize, the more accurate, the more precisely you can target a lot of this stuff. Um, which is good in one way, but you start crossing over into some areas that, of privacy and influence and whatnot. And I think one of the things that will be interesting to see when the story is finally written around the 2016 election is, what was some of the impacts of the Analytica firm that was used, that basically had gathered a whole bunch of information from Facebook and actually used it for targeting, using that information to try to identify and target specific voters, specific classes, and down to an individual basis. So interesting stuff. So it's a double. Sometimes these things can be a double-edged sword. One of the big things, one of the big things that's driven a lot of the focus of making these types of investments is the idea of reducing cost. Uh, the idea is, of having what we call the long tail, of a sales curve, being able to, here's your, you have your, you have a, when you execute a sale, basically, what will happen is you will have an impact around it that you can use for subsequent sales or whatever. For the example, what you would have is, so for example, if you bought one thing, well, can you get somebody to buy something else? Like in a Blockbuster, you saw, like, okay, if you say relative, uh, for, basically people renting movies out of Blockbuster, you fairly, you had a fair amount of stuff, but it was fairly limited. Whereas Netflix, because of the flexibility, its ability to be able to gather insights and be able to provide more functionality and more capability, the ability is you can actually sell more, do more of actually leveraging more of, from a sales perspective, leveraging more of the original sale, the impact of the original sale, basically extending the tail out longer. All right. So whereas, with, maybe this, from this first wave, you would have, X number coming off your initial sale, aka the head. If you can establish and leverage a longer tail, what that means is you've actually effectively reduced your cost, because a lot of the stuff that happens is getting somebody to make the initial, a lot of the cost is around the original sale, making the original engagement of a customer and getting them to make the initial purchase. So in that end, by using a lot of this technology, you can actually reduce cost, reduce sales costs, because you're getting, making it, number one, once you get a connection to a customer, you can make that connection more sticky, and be able to move product at a lower cost, or reduce your operating cost or your cost of sales operations, on an ongoing basis. A couple other stuff you've got, and a couple other things around reducing costs, is that you have an intermediary. Um, it used to be, the way things were structured, where you had a store, you basically had manufacturers, you had distributors, you had a whole infrastructure that was kind of set up in between, which would ultimately then move into to your ultimate, like your sales. The actual organization was doing the selling. What you've seen is, though, with the ability of getting things online, and the ability to connect directly with a customer, products, organizations can sell directly to the customer. As we get into things like with a cell phone, or the smartphone, the idea of being able to engage with a customer, over on a smartphone, you've really established a one-to-one with nothing in between. All right. So the idea of kind of moving from um, you know a traditional, um, fairly infrastructure-heavy um, operation, like your traditional sales organizations. Now what happens is you've actually taken all of the stuff that's in between, all of those products and product movements and things of that nature. You've shrunk all that stuff down, and actually you're dealing with really on a one-to-one basis. And more importantly, even with that one-to-one basis, as we see with Amazon, you're gathering more information, more insights on that one-to-one basis around kind of what uh, customers, what their thinking is, and kind of what you can be able to use to influence and do that. So that taking that intermediary stuff out and reducing it, basically um, flattening the operation, takes a lot of cost out. So this is kind of we use our kind of pictorial version of this. You know, Traditional, like the old days with IBM, manufacturer in the PC market. IBM was the manufacturer, go to a distributor, go to the retail, ultimately to the customer. Right? The idea of when Dell went into the market, they would line themselves up with like large um, distributors, like for example, or large organizations, large retailers like Walmart, and have set exclusive arrangements with them where, okay, rather than have to go through a distribution channels, you take the distribution channel out, you go directly to a retailer. So obviously you can see the net kind of a reduction of cost in that. And then Dell basically kind of took the um, took the retailer out of the equation, went directly to the customer. All right, so it's like the Dell Direct. So Dell was a real innovator around this, kind of in this space. Now, the idea of going directly, and a lot of organizations have kind of moved to this now. So you've seen a lot of like the supply chains and distribution chains of organizations have really kind of have shifted. You're seeing much more because you're seeing pretty much every organization, not every organization, maybe not every organization, but large numbers of organizations have started leveraging um, technology, as a means of establishing, this intermediary, uh, things that may sit between, an organization and directly to the customer. So we talked about effectiveness, the idea of efficiency versus effectiveness. So things we measure around the effectiveness is some things like some of the some of the MIS metrics we look at: revenues, customers. How many revenue how many customers are we adding? What is the revenue per? Or is revenue going up? Is revenue going down? This idea of a click stream. So a click stream, we talked about this earlier, like what basically like Amazon tracks everything that's happening uh, when a customer is going onto a website. So, what it's able to do, it uses something called clickstream, the data. So basically it tells you where you were at on the screen and what you were doing. It can track the exact pattern of an individual customer's navigation. So, some of the stuff it can look at, pattern of websites visited, length of stay, number of abandoned shopping carts. So, there's a lot of very valuable information, especially if you compare it back to, a regular customer engagement. If you're a producer, you're going through these different intermediaries in between. You really have no idea, by the time it goes to the actual customer, you know, at a retail operation, kind of what makes up their thinking, or kind of what goes into their thought processes, you know, by being able to interact directly and having a means of directly capturing that information, being able to go back and analyze it. Tremendous amount of insights, and be able to adjust and fine tune the products and the approaches for selling and reaching the engagement of customers. So there's really, we're talking about we talked previously about the kind of e-business model. So there's really four types of business models. What you hear is, and you'll hear the kind of terms, kind of balancing a business to customer arrangement. So what you have is at one level you have a business to business, basically one company selling to another company. Then you have a business to consumer. So that would be, as we said, like selling to selling to directly to customers. You have consumer to business, which is probably a little bit of a different model. So the consumer to business, I think the best example of that would be a customers, instead of a kind of an inverse of the business to consumer. All right, so you've got scenarios where a consumer will engage directly to instead of a consumer will go directly to business, or kind of engage with business. It's similar to that, but it kind of reverses the flow, as it were. I'm trying to think of the right way to frame it. And then we have consumer to consumer. So examples of consumer to consumer, probably the better example would be things like Lyft, all right, or eBay would be a good one. All right, so the idea of one person, one individual selling, being able to engage directly with other consumers to sell products, or to sell stuff. All right, so those are probably the more noteworthy ones. But so the idea of an e-business model, plan that details how a company will generate revenue on the internet. So there's a lot of different ways. So the question of how can a company, or how should a company best use the internet? And that answer is really depending upon the organization. Every organization can and will have a different approach to how it goes to market and how it leverages the internet and kind of what it will do. Some organizations will focus more on B2B activities, and then be maybe more traditional through a distribution channel to a retailer. Some organizations are going to be much more focused on direct consumer engagement. Like, for example, of a business to business, chemicals, obviously, consumers are not usually will not buy a couple hundred rail cars worth of chemicals. But businesses are. So the idea of being able to establish direct communications back and forth. Some of the projects I worked on in the past would be engaging one company's order to cash process to another organization's procure to pay. So things flow from one side to the other. So if we look at some of these, there's a couple different examples as we look at this. Like what would be what is Carfax, Gap.com, Amazon.com, Priceline.com, Craigslist, eBay, SAP. There's a couple, so look, each one of these are like, Carfax would be going to be a consumer to business, all right, or business to consumer. Sorry about that. Amazon, Priceline. These are going to be your more traditional. Craigslist is more of a consumer to consumer, all right, as well as eBay. And SAP, this depends on, since SAP is a supplier, so actually it can. So if you look at kind of what SAP does, it actually can operate both as a provider of technology for business to business, also the business to consumer, also for consumer to business. There's a whole, a whole variety of different things. So each organization will do different focuses. Focus. Okay, this is how we're going to leverage this stuff. Oh, there's our colors. Yeah, so Carfax. So Carfax. Um, the Gap, Amazon are all business to consumer. Priceline would be an example of a consumer to business. Consumer to consumer, Craigslist and eBay. And then, SAP would be a business to business, though theoretically the functionality they bring can actually be leveraged across, a number of these. So B2C, some examples here, three forms. Uh, Traditionally, brick and mortar. That's the one that's been around since pretty much the dawn of time. The idea of just basically, customers come into a store. The store is there. That's your engagement. Um, you've seen what's evolved though, as we've added, as we've added technology into this mix. What we've seen is kind of a couple different models. So you've got this idea of I guess, click and mortar. All right, we're basically, an organization, a business is actually, it still maintains its physical presence, its brick and mortar um, kind of approach, but it adds, an internet channel or internet approach or internet capability, for any number of reasons. Some cases it's just simply for information for customers, be able to present. Other ones can be a far more sophisticated. Sort of, for example, you see a lot of places now where you can order online and pick up in stores, or you can, or the online does the complement, or isn't actually a complement to, the physical store. So, one of the organizations, one of the companies you saw some of the stuff was Best Buy. So Best Buy was, a traditional brick and mortar organization selling, electronics. They've, because of, basically having to compete with, Amazon. You've seen them, develop both a, kind of expanding to, combine both their brick and mortar and online presence, and then also combining the two, order online, pick up in store. And then finally, we have our pure play virtual business. So, in effect, our, Amazon being the most noteworthy, though you're actually seeing Amazon, their acquisition of Whole Foods and actually creation of more physical stuff, a little bit of, you're starting to see them kind of evolving their distribution model. Because you think about, they have developed probably one of the most sophisticated distribution systems that we've ever seen. The efficiency of being able to order something and get it delivered to somebody from a whole, it's, there are different warehouses, across different regions and things of that. But even you're seeing them, you're actually seeing them kind of complement their, kind of their virtual business with physical. So the Whole Foods acquisition, you're starting to see kind of a cross meshing of that, and you're also seeing some boutique kinds of things. So that's kind of these are kind of our B2C examples. So the way you make money on this. Um, so there's a whole bunch of different things. So one example of way you make money in e-business, content providers. All right, so our classic case, Netflix, iTunes. Being able to um, allow customers to come in, identify, get find and download content. Can be in this case can be movies or music. Intermediaries which would be kind of an aggregation. So Zillow.com, which is real estate, what it will do is it will actually pull information, aggregate information of of real estate um, offerings, and then kind of present it under a common into a common interface. So so it pulls everything. That's you can go out there and so basically from one seat you can see everything that's for sale really across the country, theoretically the world. Online marketplaces, obviously Amazon.com, the most noteworthy of that. Portals. So Yahoo was a traditional one. Google is another one. One of the most amazing things about Google is that they were able to take the concept of doing internet search and monetizing it. All right. So the idea is, the original Alta Vista, which was the first, I think the first search engine, was really all it did is just did a search engine. So it just you enter, it would gather information from the internet, put it in one spot, then you can go and read information back. What Google did, Google basically did the same thing, but they added an additional feature of targeted advertising. So what it would do is if you were looking something up, it would then be able to take that information and based upon what the results you get back, it also present advertisements which would look like results, but if you were to click that, would actually generate a revenue stream. Very lucrative, multi-billion-dollar revenue stream for Google on that one, which has really been the engine that's driven that drives their business. Some other, some other solutions here: service providers, YouTube.com, transaction brokers, any sort of financial. So E-Trade would be an example, or Fidelity, other types of organizations like that. A lot of different things. There's a lot of different ways to generate revenue. So for me, the most interesting one is Google, since Google is the guys who basically took search, found the way to monetize it and do it in a very inobtrusive fashion, so as to not necessarily interfere. You're having advertisements presented to you, but in such a fashion so it's not to be overt, like with pop-ups and all sorts of things. So we talked a little bit, search engine, Google's line, that is their line of business. So this is their, the model they use is something called AdWords. So what you do is advertisers will basically buy search terms. All right. And the idea is, if you put something out there, if somebody clicks on it, you don't get charged. It'll put the stuff up on the screen, on the return set, but it will not charge unless somebody clicks through to it. All right. So that's kind of so that's been very, very lucrative. You've seen actually that's the same model that we've seen Facebook has adopted, Twitter. I mean, the big challenge of all of these organizations or these kind of large social media is how to take that information and monetize it. So a lot of it is through advertising, and kind of blending or kind of feeding the advertising into their stream. So you'll see things like, for example, with Google, since Google owns YouTube, when you go to certain YouTube videos, what you'll get is, before you can get to it, it'll give you an advertisement. You can click through after like 10 seconds of the advertisement, or you can, sign up for a membership. You should never see any ads at all. So those are all kind of some different kinds of examples. But that's been it's been one of the things you've seen is the ability to monetize more over and above the just simply the buying and selling of goods. So a couple, some other examples here of revenue generating strategies. So we talked about e-revenue, e-business revenue. So advertising, licensing, subscription fees, transaction fees, value-added services fees. So these are some of the examples we've seen in different, that organizations have used to generate revenue from their e-business. So as I said, some things are actually complementary or ancillary to kind of maybe a core functionality. All right. But then we also have some other some other areas here like pay per click, pay per call, pay per conversation. The challenge has been, and I think kind of the expectation that has been set is that people will not necessarily, in some cases they will pay a subscription fee, or maybe they will or do something like a pay per click. But there's been a perception, well, the internet is all free, so the ability to, like for example, Google, you'd be able to do searches on stuff, and you do it theoretically for free. But however, what's happening is Google's able to, what they've been able to do is drive information from their um, advertising fees, and in addition, be able to gather insightful information around kind of what that has value that they can sell as well around kind of what behaviors and predicting responses and things of that nature. So a lot of different things over and above just simply doing your traditional selling stuff. So communication. So you say different types of collaboration. So one of the things we've seen over the past 30 years is you know, um, the adoption of using technology, internet access as a means of providing different types of communication. So the examples we have here, probably the most noteworthy, the longest established, most noteworthy, email. It's been around 30 plus years, maybe 40 years now. Still pretty still pretty impactful. But we see more like instant messaging, IMs, can take the form of either text messages or maybe through like a messaging broker of some type, a whole bunch of different forms. The thing it really has exploded, made this explode is the kind of smartphones is basically one of the key core functionalities that are in a smartphone. So people can communicate, have developed the expectation they can communicate to anybody, anytime. Podcasting, which is kind of an interesting area, started off. It's been around a while. It has really kind of become a pretty significant segment of from communications. If you go out, if you look on, like for example, on their iTunes, you'll see very thousands of different kinds of podcasts. Easy to set up. There's not a little barriers to do it. All sorts of different topics. So like anybody anybody can basically create their own podcast. So it's gotten. I think the growth. If anything, we've seen probably a pretty significant growth around that. Video conferencing and web conferencing. Video conferencing had been around for a while, but usually it was a fairly expensive proposition to kind of set up a video conference, in a conference room, back in the day. Now what you're seeing is with the internet and the ability to, kind of leverage, things like smartphones and internet, this idea of being able to do video conferencing, web conferencing, be able to do collaboration, especially, large organizations being able to, bring people in from any number of locations. So location, it used to be organizations, everybody had to be in the same building. Now you can be anywhere. All right. And this idea of, as we say, content management systems, which is this, the ability to identify, track, manage electronic documents, electronic content, all throughout an organization. The amount of data that's in an organization, is moved beyond the simple filing techniques. You need something a bit more. So content management will have things around search capability, or combining things like search capabilities and classification capabilities, and kind of intelligent functionality around being able to deal with content and documents. So Web 2.0. All right, so we talked about Web 1.0. So Web 1.0, as we said, from 91 to about 2003. It was kind of that first generation kind of establishing. Web 2.0, we hear a Web 2.0. So Web 2.0 is, kind of we call the next generation of internet use. More mature, more sophisticated communications. The first, one of the challenges, with the early versions of, like websites and stuff. If you look at the early websites, they were pretty. You look at them now, they look pretty primitive. I mean, they were. They were, fairly simple, fairly blocky kinds of things. Now you're seeing a much more sophisticated, kind of interface, um, combined with, a much more ubiquitous, much more robust networking connections. In the early days of Web 1.0, the way you got on the internet, you dialed into it. Now we've got very high speed access, basically wherever you are at, either through a wireless or through a cell phone provider. So we've got a lot of capability there, and three characteristics as we call out here. What we call Web 2.0: collaboration, sharing, and it's free. So basically, you've got a lot of the ability to um, you know communicate and share information, and interact. So that, I guess maybe the other word that would come into play would be kind of interactive. A much more interactive, much more engaged kind of utilization of the web. So from outsourcing, some things we've seen. This has been kind of an evolution as we've seen kind of coming out of 2.0. Kind of what this engagement allows you to do. This idea of crowdsourcing. So we'll talk around, the term that gets used is wisdom of the crowd. So if you be able to crowdsourcing, be able to identify information, be able to aggregate large amounts of information or kind of aggregated information. Wikipedia would be an example of something like that. It's a free encyclopedia, made up of people, gathering and kind of adding information, incrementally on a global basis. Crowdfunding, the ability to aggregate, be able to, put requests, GoFundMe, things like that, be able to put requests out there, people can access them and provide funding for uh, for different types of projects or endeavors. Types of communication, asynchronous communication, email, which has really been good for that. You get to kind of, you write an email, you send it on its way, it gets to somebody, can get to them, they can respond immediately, they can respond in a week, a day, a year. Or synchronous communications, which is instantaneous, basically online interaction. So this is some of the different types of collaboration we see, kind of within an organization, but also in a broader outside of an organization. So one of the newer things that we've seen with the internet, was this idea of a social network. Social networks did not really come into play until the mid 2000, like maybe 2005, 2006. So they are really, we're talking relatively early days, but even within that relatively short amount of time they've been out there, very significant impact, social impact, engagement. People, kind of have used this as the mechanism for, collaborating, for engaging, across the board. So, the idea of social media, social networking. So all these things have, it used to be technology was used, ideally as at first from kind of a back office business, in the early days with mainframes, to be kind of come of a business platform. You know, the idea of the social network really kind of engages people, not merely on a commercial basis, but on a social basis. All right, so the idea is, websites that rely on user participation, user um, contributed content. I think we've mentioned kind of Wikipedia, which would kind of fall maybe into that category, but there's other ones out there. Social network, obviously Facebook, and Twitter are the most noteworthy ones. The impact of both, I think, impact of both has been very significant. And then social networking through, probably the best. There's a number of different social networking we've seen out there, especially around professional networks like LinkedIn. So the ability to kind of be able to search and engage people, you know, through kind of specialized, focused. So social tagging, kind of a different is kind of evolved and rolling. So if you've kind of seen this, you kind of look at this evolution on cell phones. Social tagging, kind of original cell phones, the iPhone, uh, BlackBerry mobile phone. So you've got it. This is kind of an example of of this folksonomy, which I think is, I'm not sure if that's a real word, but this, once again, this is kind of idea of an extension of social engagement, social engagement, leveraging technology. Blogs, another very significant things that basically the idea of being able to print, develop your own content, print it, make it accessible to large numbers of people. Think about before the advent of the internet and the blogging. If you wanted to publish something, you basically had to you would go to a publisher and have it printed on a piece of paper or in a book form and sent out and distributed. Now, anybody with a laptop, anybody with a phone can create content, post it, and have anybody basically on the planet you know access it. And this has actually been expanded not merely for words or text, but graphics, video. So you see, the idea of using YouTube as a social engagement. So it's these are the types of things we see in terms of social content, social interaction. Leveraging technology, and then wiki. Collaborative page allows people to add, change content. The idea is, what we call the network effect. So really, you want to have more people engaged, and things will evolve over time. So Wikipedia is an encyclopedia, but there's other wikis out there, which basically, so the wiki actually refers to a type of collaborative web page construction that lets you kind of has the structure that you see, but so it's not limited to Wikipedia. It's probably Wikipedia is the best known one, but there's other ones that are out there as well. A mashup. Now, a mashup's kind of an interesting thing. Basically, you think about the different types of content that is on the internet that basically that can be identified and pulled from different sources. The idea of a mashup is that you can go out and take individual bits of content from different places on the internet and combine and pull them things together. So you can combine, say for example, text plus video plus photo, and put it all on one page, and it can be sourced from a number of different areas. So you'll see, the term gets used, aggregation, being able to multiple, present one thing, but being able to pull it from different sources. And then obviously with Web 2, after Web 2.0, we have Web 3.0. So Web 3.0 is where we start applying artificial intelligence with the intelligent web applications. So engaging through speech. So as we see with Amazon Alexa, and other other speech-enabled applications. Some machine learning, reasoning. This is still fairly early days. I mean, Alexa's kind of it's an interesting application, but there's limitations around it. But obviously, next generations, as we continue to add more capability, more functionality, any of these things become more adaptable, more usable, more functional. And then there's a concept called the semantic web. So it's kind of a, this has been around a while. A big, so that's a very big topic area, research area. It describes things in a way that computers can understand. So the idea is that this idea of interactions with computers. I mean, traditionally, computer interaction is really taken the form of like keyboards, but semantic web is another type of interaction. And being able to leverage and structure the web in such a fashion so that you can do more stuff with, from a computer. You're actually leveraging a computer to use more of it. So you're starting to see, we've seen for a long time this idea of utilization of the internet in different fashions. So the early days of this was really around kind of business. All right, but then you also had kind of the consumer side of things, and also government. So we haven't really, of the three, probably government is probably the one has might have the most potential in the future. It has not been probably fully exploited yet. Not like it's not quite as rich as, for example, say like business and consumer. Government organizations and utilization of technology tends to be a laggard in terms of being able to effectively utilize it. As opposed to where you'd see companies are being much more innovative early on. But you're going to see a lot more. My suspicion is, my sense is, you're going to see more and more of this, becoming, in order to make government more efficient, the ability of digitizing it and kind of digitizing engagement becomes becomes one of the criteria we're going to be looking for. One of the big innovations, I always like to kind of point out as '07 as a tipping point or an inflection point of kind of disruptive technology, really identified, defined really by things like the iPhone, the ability to kind of create a mobile platform, highly functional mobile platform that could be used to do stuff on. Right. So the idea is, the iPhone, its successors, and other products of that type, basically Amazon or Android, which was what Google put out, as a competitor to the iPhone, which had really emerged as the two definitive mobile platforms. Part of what's come out of that, having that capability, is this idea of mobile business, the ability to purchase goods and services through a wireless connection. And it can take any numbers of factors. So obviously, the usual suspects, Amazon, but financial information, financial stuff. Basically this idea of taking traditional kind of internet access to a browser and just providing it the ability to communicate, to leverage that in the same fashion, using a mobile device, right? Which is really, that has been probably over the past 10 years one of the emergence of that, because what happens is it opens up a whole new world of basically customer engagement, and also being able to identify and identify activities engaging with customers in different ways, and be able to gain additional insights into customers' thinkings and activities and behaviors. So this is really what has driven the modern world, probably over the past 10 years, and probably for the foreseeable future. And that is really it for Chapter 3.